Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a quiet school morning in 1955, into a bright, warm classroom near the end of a long tiled hallway. The kind of room where the afternoon light falls soft across a row of little practice kitchens, and something is always gently baking somewhere just out of sight. There's a smell here you may remember, or wish you did. Warm flour and sweet vanilla, the faint metal of a sewing machine, starch and clean cotton, chalk dust drifting in the sun. This is the home economics room, and for a whole generation of American girls it was one of the most important rooms in the building. Before we settle in, I want to say a genuine thank you to the listener who suggested this one. You send me the loveliest, most thoughtful ideas, and honestly, so much of what this little channel becomes is shaped by the notes you leave. It means more than I can say. If you feel like it, and only if you feel like it, you're always welcome to like the video, to subscribe, or to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. No pressure at all. And if you would rather drift off with these stories somewhere else, the channel is now on Spotify too, with a link waiting in the description whenever you want it. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights until the room goes soft. Switch on a fan for that gentle hush of moving air. Pull the blanket up, find the cool side of the pillow, and let your shoulders come down from your ears. And let yourself wonder for a moment. What did a Tuesday morning actually feel like in a 1950s classroom? What did it feel like to tie on your very first apron, the fabric still crisp from home? What did the sewing machines sound like, all of them running at once? What did your teacher smell like as she leaned over your shoulder to guide your hands? What did the girls whisper about while they waited for the biscuits to rise? And just like that, it is 1955. The morning bell has just rung. Somewhere down the hall a door clicks shut. The ovens are warming, the light is golden, and your home economics class is about to begin. Let's start where every lesson began, with the room itself. It sat a little apart from the rest of the school, its own small kingdom of counters and cupboards, and the moment you walked in you understood that this was not quite like your other classes. Along one wall stood a row of miniature kitchens, each with its own little stove, its own sink, its own set of cabinets painted the same soft pastel as the walls. On the other side waited the sewing tables, long and scarred and honest, each one holding a heavy black machine that seemed to be watching you. The air smelled faintly of everything that had ever been made there. And you knew, even before the teacher spoke, that in this room you were meant to learn how to make a life. The floor was not like the floors in the rest of the school. It was a checkerboard of linoleum, cool underfoot, scrubbed so often it had gone soft and pale at the edges, where 100 pairs of shoes had turned the same corners year after year. The light came in long and low through tall windows, catching the dust in the air, laying warm gold across the countertops. There was a clock on the wall that ticked a little louder than clocks in other rooms, or so it seemed, because here you were always waiting for something, for the dough to rise, for the kettle to sing, for the timer to release you from your standing and stirring. Everything in that room had its place, and the having of a place was part of the lesson. The measuring cups nested one inside the other, in a drawer that closed with a satisfying wooden thunk. The mixing bowls stacked from largest to smallest in the low cupboard. The good scissors lived in one spot and the everyday scissors in another, and heaven help the girl who mixed them up. You learned, without anyone quite saying it, that a well-run room and a well-run home were the same idea wearing different clothes. Order was not fussiness here. Order was how you kept from drowning in the 100 small tasks a day could bring. Look closely, and you would find the small evidences of every girl who had come before you. A scorch mark on a wooden spoon, a patch of counter worn smoother than the rest, exactly where the elbow of a right-handed girl would rest while she creamed butter and sugar by hand. initials pressed faintly into the underside of a table by some bored, restless student in a year you would never know. The room held their memory the way a kitchen at home holds the memory of every Sunday dinner, quietly in the grain of the wood. Your teacher's desk sat at the front, but she was almost never behind it. She belonged to the aisles, moving between the little kitchens with her hands clasped, pausing at your shoulder to watch you fold or measure or pin. She had a way of correcting you that did not sting, a way of saying, "Try it once more, this time like this," that made you want to get it right, not because you feared her, but because you did not want to disappoint her. She had raised a family of her own, most of them had, and everything she taught came salted with the authority of a woman who had actually done it, through lean years and full ones alike. There was a particular hush to the room in the first minutes of the period, before the machine started up and the ovens filled the air with warmth. You would hang up your coat, find your station, and settle in, and for a moment the whole room seemed to hold its breath together. Then the work began, and the sounds arrived one by one, the whir of a mixer, the snip of scissors, the low conversation of girls who had learned to talk and work at the same time, and the room came alive the way a house comes alive when a family wakes inside it. It is a strange thing to say about a classroom, but you loved that room. Not the way you loved recess or the last bell, but in a deeper, quieter way, the way you would later love a kitchen of your own on a winter evening. It asked something real of you. It handed you tasks with beginnings and endings, tasks that left something behind when you were finished. A hem, a loaf, a clean and folded stack of dish towels. In an ordinary school day of things half understood and quickly forgotten, this was a place where the work was true. We do not really have rooms like this anymore, and something has been lost in the letting go of them. A place where a young person was taught, patiently and without hurry, that a home did not simply happen, that it was made, hand over hand, choice by choice, from morning until night. Whatever we might think now of all it asked of the girls who filled it, the room itself was honest. It smelled of flour and thread and effort, and it believed, with its whole pastel heart, that the ordinary work of caring for people was worth teaching well. And so, on that first morning, you took your place in it, and you began. Before the first recipe, before the first stitch, there was a symbol. Somewhere in the room, perhaps above the chalkboard or beside the door, sat a small brass lamp shaped like something out of a colonial kitchen, a shallow dish with a little wick and a hinged lid. This was the Betty lamp, the quiet emblem of home economics itself, and your teacher would tell you what it stood for. It was meant to represent light and warmth and the steady, unshowy work of keeping a home glowing from the inside. It is easy now to walk past a symbol like that, but in that room, on that first morning, it felt like a promise about the kind of woman you were being asked to become. The lamp itself was small enough to hold in 2 hands, and old-fashioned even then, a shape your great-grandmother might have recognised from a farmhouse kitchen lit long before electricity reached down the county road. It had no bulb, no cord, nothing modern about it at all. In the old days it had burned grease or oil, throwing a small stubborn light into a dark room so that a woman could see to sew or read or tend a child after the sun went down. That was the whole point of it. It was a light that let the work of a household go on after everything else had gone dark. Your teacher spoke of it with a kind of reverence that surprised you the first time you heard it. She would tell you that the lamp stood for the light of learning and the warmth of the home, and that the two belonged together, that a woman who tended her household well was tending a small steady flame that the rest of the family gathered around without even knowing they did it. It sounded almost like poetry, and you were young enough to roll your eyes a little inside, and old enough, some of you, to feel it land somewhere true. The lamp had a companion too, a motto that went with it, the idea that you should aim toward new goals as the lamp lit the way. It was stitched onto banners and pressed onto pins and printed on the covers of the little booklets you carried. And whatever you made of the sentiment, there was something in it that stayed with you. The notion that keeping a home was not a lesser thing, not a fallback or a settling, but a calling with its own light and its own dignity. In a world that did not always tell girls their work mattered, here was a small brass lamp insisting that it did. You would see that lamp everywhere once you knew to look for it. On the emblem of the future homemakers of America, on the certificate you took home at the end of the year, on the cover of the cookbook your mother kept in the kitchen drawer, its pages soft and stained from use. It became a kind of quiet handshake between women, a sign that said, I know this work, I have done this work, I carry this light too. There was a fellowship in it that you would only fully understand years later, standing in your own kitchen at the end of a long day. It is worth pausing on how much meaning was folded into so small a thing. The whole philosophy of that room, its earnest belief in care and order and warmth, gathered itself into one little brass lamp that could not even be lit anymore. And maybe that is how symbols always work. They hold more than they should be able to. They let a girl of 14 glimpse for just a moment the shape of a life she had not yet lived. We have mostly forgotten the Betty lamp now. It sits, if it sits anywhere, in the back of a display case in some historical society, or tucked in a box in an attic beside a graduation tassel and a faded pin. Most people who pass it would have no idea what it meant, or to whom, or how it once glowed with significance in the imagination of a young girl on the first morning of a new school year. And that is a small sadness, the way it always is when a meaning slips loose from its object and drifts away. But you knew. On that morning, before you had measured a single cup of flour or threaded a single needle, you looked at that little lamp and you understood, in the wordless way the young understand things, that you were being invited into something old and warm and larger than yourself. A long line of women had tended that light before you. A long line would tend it after. And for one bright year, in one bright room, the tending would be yours. It was a heavy thing to hand a girl so young, but it was handed gently and lit softly, and it warmed the whole room from where it sat. It is the very beginning of the period now, before any work has started. Every girl reaches for her apron, and there is a small ceremony in it that nobody ever names out loud. Some of you sewed your own the year before, and you know every seam of it. Others pull a fresh cotton one from a hook along the wall, still smelling of laundry soap and the iron. You loop it over your head, cross the strings behind your back, and tie them in a neat bow at your waist, and something in you settles. The apron told you the play was about to begin. It said, gently, that for the next hour your hands belonged to the work. The aprons themselves were a small map of the whole class. You could read a girl's year in hers. The beginners wore the plain ones, simple cotton half-aprons in cheerful gingham, or a modest floral print, the kind a mother might run up on a Sunday afternoon. The girls who'd been at it longer wore aprons they had made themselves, and you could see the growing skill in the details, a ruffle here, a bit of rick-rack there, a pocket set on just so, a hem so even it might have come from a shop. An apron was the first real thing many of you ever made, and you wore it like a small badge of everything you had learned. There was a comfort in the fabric itself, worn soft by washing, faintly warm from hanging in the sun of the window. It smelled of home, of the soap flakes your mother used, and the starch and the clean iron heat, and pulling it on was like being briefly wrapped in the kitchen you had left that morning. For the length of the period, you were not quite a schoolgirl anymore. You were something closer to the women you had watched all your life, the aunt at the stove, the grandmother at the sink, your own mother turning from the counter with flour on her hands. The tying of it had its own small rules. You looped it over your head, if it was the kind with a bib, and settled the neck strap, and then came the crossing of the strings, behind the back and around to the front, or a simple bow at the small of the waist. Some girls could tie theirs blind, hands moving behind them with easy certainty. Others still fumbled, and a friend would lean over with a laugh and set it right. And there was a warmth in that too, in the small helping hands of the girl beside you. And then there was the checking. Your teacher expected the apron on before the work, always, and she would glance down the rows to be sure. An apron meant you took the task seriously. It meant you understood that flour flew and grease spattered and thread and lint gathered on a dark skirt, and that a girl who came to the counter unprotected was a girl who had not yet learned to respect the work. To forget your apron was a small embarrassment, quickly fixed, but felt. The apron was the uniform, and you did not step onto the field without it. There is a whole lost language in that simple act, the tying on of an apron. It marked a border between one kind of time and another. On this side, the ordinary distracted rush of a school day. On that side, the focused, hands-on, one thing at a time world of making something real. We have very few thresholds like that left in our days now, few small rituals that tell the body now we begin. We slip from one thing to the next without ceremony, and perhaps we're a little poorer for it. But you had this, the reaching for the apron on its hook, the soft weight of it settling over you, the cross and the tie and the smoothing of it flat against your front. And with that, the mind quieted and the hands woke up. Whatever was troubling you in the hallway, whatever note had been passed or word had stung, it loosened its hold when the apron went on. There was work to do now, good work, work with a beginning and a middle and an end, and you were ready for it. At the close of the year, when the last class let out, you would untie it one final time and fold it away, and it would go home to a drawer and stay there quietly for longer than you could imagine. Girls kept those aprons for decades. Grown women, mothers and grandmothers themselves, would find one folded in the bottom of a cedar chest and hold it and be 14 again for just a moment, back in the pastel room with the golden light. It was only cotton and thread, but you tied your girlhood into it, bough by careful bough, and something of you stayed stitched inside. Let's begin with something that looks simple and never quite is. Before you were trusted with a stove, you were taught to set a table, and you learned it the way you learned the alphabet, one careful piece at a time. The plate in the centre, the fork on the left resting on its folded napkin, the knife to the right, its blade turned politely inward, the spoon beside it, the glass just above the tip of the knife. Your teacher walked the rows with her hands clasped behind her, checking each setting like an inspector, and you learned that a table was not just a place to eat. It was a small, daily act of care that told your family they were worth the trouble. The pieces themselves felt heavier than you expected, the way real things do when you're used to handling toy versions of them. The forks had a satisfying weight in the hand. The knives lay cool and solid against your palm. Even the everyday flatware the school kept for practice had a certain dignity when you were arranging it with such care, and you handled each piece as if it mattered, because you were being taught that it did. There was a logic to it once you learned to see it, and the logic was half the lesson. The blade of the knife turned inward toward the plate, never out, because a blade turned toward your neighbour was a small rudeness, an unkindness in metal. The forks lined up on the left in the order you would use them, the outside ones first, working your way in as the meal went on, so that a guest never had to wonder or guess. Everything was arranged from the outside in the order of the courses, a quiet kindness built right into the shape of the table. You were setting a stage so that no one who sat down would ever feel lost. The napkin had its own small art, folded into a neat triangle or a simple rectangle, tucked just so beneath the forks or laid in the centre of the plate. Later, if you got clever, you might learn to fold it into something prettier, a little fan or a standing peak for company days. But the plain fold came first, and there was a rhythm to making a whole row of them match, crease after crease, until the table looked like it belonged to a family that had its affairs in order. Your teacher was exacting about all of it, and you came to understand that the exactness was the point. A fork a half-inch out of a line, a glass set too far to the left, a napkin folded carelessly, and she would pause at your station and simply look, and you would see it yourself and fix it before she had to say a word. She was not teaching you to be rigid. She was teaching you to see, to notice the small things that a distracted person walked right past, because a home was kept, in the end, by a woman who noticed. And underneath the placement of forks lay something larger, something she wanted you to feel and not just memorize. A table set with care said something to the people who gathered around it. It said, "I thought about you before you arrived." It said, "This meal, this evening, this ordinary Tuesday, is worth a little ceremony." In a busy household with money often tight and time always short, the setting of a proper table was a small daily insistence that the family mattered, that supper was not just fuel but a gathering, a pause, a coming together at the end of the day. We have mostly let this go now, and we tell ourselves we're busier than they were, though it is hard to believe that is really true. We eat standing at the counter, or in front of a glowing screen, or in the car with the food warm in our laps. The fork on the left and the knife on the right have become quaint, a thing for holidays, if we bother even then. And there is a freedom in that, of course. But there is also something we have quietly misplaced, some small daily reverence for the simple act of sitting down together. You would carry the lesson out of that room and into your own life, and you would find that your hands remembered it long after you had forgotten you were ever taught. The fork went to the left without your thinking about it. The blade turned inward on its own. And on the evenings that mattered, when there was someone to feed and something to celebrate, however small, you would set the table properly, piece by careful piece, and feel the old lesson stir in you. A place for everything cared for, and the people you loved, sitting down to find that you had thought of them before they came. Now comes the moment you'd been waiting for since September. Your teacher hands out the first recipe card, and you bend over it the way you might bend over a letter from far away. There is a whole language here, and you're only beginning to learn it. Sift, fold, cream, blend until smooth. A pinch of this, a level cup of that. You read it twice, then a third time, trying to see the finished thing behind the words. Around you, the room fills with the soft rustle of girls doing the same, and for a moment nobody is talking, because everybody is listening to the recipe the way you listen to instructions you very much do not want to get wrong. The card itself was a modest thing, a rectangle of stiff paper with the words typed or printed in tidy lines, and yet it held a whole afternoon inside it. At the top, the list of ingredients waiting to be gathered. Below, the steps, laid out one after another in the order they must be done. You learned quickly that a recipe was not really a paragraph to be read, but a set of instructions to be obeyed, in sequence, without skipping ahead, and that the trouble usually came from a girl who thought she could jump a step or trust her memory instead of the card. The words were the first mountain to climb. So many of them meant something different in the kitchen than they meant anywhere else. To cream butter and sugar did not mean to pour cream over anything, but to beat them together until they went pale and fluffy and soft, a thing you had to feel your way toward the first few times. To fold did not mean to bend, but to turn something gently over on itself, again and again, so as not to knock the air out of it. To sift was to shake the flour through a fine mesh until it fell light as snow. Each word was a small door, and behind each door was a motion of the hands you had to learn by doing. Then came the measurements, precise and unforgiving in their way. A level cup, not a heaping one. A scant half, a rounded quarter. A pinch you learned to judge between two fingers. A dash, a dollop. Words that seemed almost playful until you understood that a cook was expected to know exactly what each one meant, because a family supper depended on her getting it right. You bent over the card and translated it in your head, turning the words into a picture of the work, seeing the bowl and the spoon, and your own hands moving through the steps before you had touched a thing. Your teacher taught you the discipline of reading it all the way through before you began, every line of it, so that you would not find yourself halfway along with the oven cold and the butter still hard in the icebox. Read it first, she would say, all of it, and then gather what you need, and then begin. It sounded so simple, but it was a lesson in patience and foresight that reached far past the kitchen. The same steady habit that would one day help you plan a week or run a household or think a hard thing through before you leapt. There was a particular quiet that settled over the room in those first minutes of reading, and you would remember it. A dozen girls or more all bent over their little cards, lips moving faintly, brows drawn down in concentration. No one wanted to be the one who forgot the salt, or misread the temperature, or pulled a flat, sad thing from the oven while the others rose golden and proud. So you read, and you read again, and you fixed the steps in your mind like a small poem you would have to recite with your hands. We have mostly lost this careful way of reading now. We glance at a screen, half our mind elsewhere, and let a video show us what to do, and we rarely bend over a recipe with that wholehearted, worried attention anymore. There is ease in that, and speed. But there was something in the old way, in the stiff card and the quiet room and the slow translating of word into motion, that made the cooking feel like a thing you had truly learned, and not just a thing you had watched. And when at last you looked up from the card, you understood a little more of the language than you had a moment before. Sift and fold and cream had begun to mean something to your hands and not just your eyes. You were being let into a conversation that women had been having with one another for generations, passed down on cards and in the margins of stained cookbooks and across kitchen tables, a whole warm dialect of care. You did not speak it fluently yet, but you had read your first sentence in it, and you had understood. And that was where every good cook in every warm kitchen had once begun. Let's talk about the part of cooking that felt almost like arithmetic. In the sewing corner you could ease a mistake, coax it, hide it in a hem. But baking, your teacher warned, kept its own strict accounts. You learned to level off a cup of flour with the flat back of a knife, to spoon and never pack, to measure the baking powder with a seriousness that seemed almost funny until the day your cake came out flat and you understood. A quarter teaspoon too much, a careless scoop, and the whole thing forgave nothing. There was a lesson tucked inside all that precision, one that reached far past the kitchen, that some kinds of care could not be faked. The tools of it had a plain, honest beauty. The nested measuring cups, tin or aluminum, each stamped with its fraction. The little spoons on their ring, from the tablespoon down to the tiny quarter teaspoon that looked too small to matter and mattered most of all. A glass measuring cup with the lines etched up its side for liquids, because liquids, you learned, were measured differently, poured to the mark and read at eye level, bending down to check that you had it true. Each tool had its own right use, and using the wrong one was a small mistake that could undo an afternoon. You learned the difference between measuring the wet and the dry, which seemed like a fussy distinction until you understood why it was there. Dry things were spooned lightly into the cup and levelled off flush across the top with the back of a knife, never packed, never shaken down, never scooped straight from the bin in a way that pressed the flour tight. Wet things were poured to the line and read from the side. Brown sugar was its own stubborn exception, packed firmly so it held the shape of the cup when you turned it out, and you had to remember which was which, and the remembering was part of becoming a cook. The great teacher in all of this was failure, honest and immediate. Cooking a soup or a stew was forgiving. A pinch more of this, a splash more of that, taste and adjust and taste again, and you could wander toward the right thing by feel. But baking held you to account. Flour was scaffolding, and eggs were structure, and the leavening was chemistry you could not see and could not argue with. Too much baking powder and your cake rose in a rush and collapsed. Too little, and it sat there heavy and dense, a small monument to carelessness. The oven did not care about your intentions. It only cared about the truth of what you had measured. And so you learned to slow down at the counter, to give the measuring the attention it demanded. You learned to read the recipe's numbers as seriously as sums on a test, because in a way they were a test, one the oven would grade with perfect honesty in 25 minutes' time. Your teacher stood over the shy ones, guiding the knife across the cup, showing them the level, drilling the difference between a rounded spoonful and a level one until it became second nature. She knew that a girl who learned to measure truly had learned something she could trust for the rest of her life. There was a strange satisfaction in it once the fear wore off. The precise little motions, the clean level cup, the exactness of it, so different from the loose improvisation of a stovetop. Baking rewarded the careful and the patient, the girl who followed the steps and trusted the recipe over her own restless certainty. And when it worked, when the cake rose tall and golden and even, there was a pride in it that felt earned in a way few school things ever did, because you knew you'd gotten every small measurement right. Underneath all the levelling and spooning ran that larger lesson your teacher was really after, the one she never quite said outright. Some things in life could be smoothed over, coaxed, forgiven, hidden away in a hem, and some things simply had to be done right, with attention and honesty, or they would fail, plainly and for everyone to see. Baking was practice for that harder truth. It taught you that care was not always a feeling, but sometimes a discipline, a matter of doing the small, dull steps exactly, patiently, every single time, whether anyone was watching or not. We measure more loosely now, most of us, a scoop and a guess and a shrug, and our cakes are sometimes the worse for it, though we rarely stop to wonder why. But somewhere, a woman who learned it young still spoons her flour and levels it clean without a thought, her hands keeping faith with a lesson learned over a tin cup in a bright pastel room. A quarter teaspoon, measured true. It seems like such a small thing. But you learned, that year, that the small things were never really small at all. It is time now to sit down in front of the thing that scared half the class. The sewing machine waited on its table, heavy and dark and faintly oily, and learning it began with learning to be unafraid of it. First you practiced without any thread at all, guiding paper along printed lines, coaxing your foot onto the treadle or the pedal, learning that steady, even rhythm that separated a smooth seam from a crooked one. The machine hummed under your hands like something half alive, and when the whole room ran their machines together, that low, industrious drone filled the space like the sound of a small factory made entirely of girls learning to make their own way. The machine had a presence to it, sitting there black and solid, its curves gleaming dully, its name spelled out in faded gold along the arm, It smelled of oil and metal and the faint warmth of a motor. There was a wheel on the side you turned to lower the needle, a series of dials and knobs whose purposes you would learn one by one, and that needle sharp and quick, rising and falling faster than the eye could follow once the machine got going. The first time you heard one run at full speed, you understood exactly why half the class sat down afraid. So you began gently, and the gentleness was wise. Before a single thread was allowed near the thing, you fed plain paper under the needle and practiced steering it along printed lines. Straight ones first, then gentle curves, then the sharp corners where you had to stop with the needle down, lift the foot, pivot the paper, and go on. The needle punched neat little holes as you went, a dotted record of your steadiness or your wobble, and you could read your own progress in those rows of holes, watching the line grow truer day by day. The hardest part was the foot, the coaxing of an even speed. Too timid, and the machine lurched and stalled and the line went ragged. Too eager, and it bolted forward and ran away from you, the needle racing off the line before you could catch it. You had to find the middle, that steady, patient pressure that kept the machine moving at a pace your hands could follow, and finding it took time, and no small number of crooked practice rows, and a certain willingness to fail quietly and try again. It was, though no one said so, a small lesson in self-command, in the taming of your own nervous hurry. Then at last came the thread, and a whole new set of mysteries. The threading of the machine was its own puzzle. Up and over and down and through, around the little hooks and guides in exactly the right order, and through the eye of that fast bright needle, which took a steady hand and good light, and more than a little patience. The bobbin had to be wound and set in its case below, and the two threads brought up together, and if you got any step of it wrong, the machine would jam or skip or leave a nest of tangled thread on the underside of your work, and you would have to stop and pick it out and start the threading over. But oh, when it went right, when the thread was true and the tension was even, and your foot found that steady middle speed, the seam ran out from under the needle straight and smooth and even, two pieces of cloth becoming one before your eyes, and something in you leapt. You had made a seam, a real one, that would hold. The machine that had frightened you an hour before was suddenly a tool in your hands, obedient and swift, and you understood in a flash all the things you might make with it, the dresses and the curtains and the small clothes for children not yet born. There was a fellowship in the sound of it too. When the whole room ran their machines together, that low, steady drone rose up and filled the space, and you were part of it. One small engine in a room full of them, all of you bent over your work, all of you learning the same patient craft. It was a homely, industrious music, the sound of girls learning to make and mend and provide, and it connected you to every woman who had ever sat at such a machine to clothe a family on a thin budget with clever hands. We buy our clothes ready-made now, mostly, and the machine sits silent in closets, if we keep them at all, and few of us could thread one without a struggle. Something practical and something proud has quietly slipped away in that. But a girl who learned it young never entirely forgot the feel of it, the hum under her hands, the seam running true. You had met the machine and made your peace with it, and in doing so you had gained a small, real power, the power to make with your own two hands the things your family would wear and use and live inside. Let's move to the wide cutting tables now, where the real mystery of sewing began. Your teacher unfolded a pattern, that whisper-thin tissue paper covered in strange lines and little arrows and words like selvage and grain and notch. It looked like a map to a country nobody had visited. You learned to pin it just so, to lay it with the grain, to press down the pattern weights and trace around the edges with tailor's chalk. Cutting into good fabric for the first time took a breath of courage, because there was no taking it back. But slowly the flat shapes began to make sense, and you understood that a dress was only a puzzle you had not yet solved. The pattern came folded into an envelope with a picture on the front, a drawing of the finished garment worn by a woman with an impossibly serene expression, and inside was a marvel of paper engineering that seemed at first to make no sense at all. The tissue was so thin you could nearly see through it, and it tore if you looked at it wrong, and it was covered edge to edge with lines and symbols in a code you had to learn to read. There were solid lines and dotted lines, little triangles pointing outward, double lines meaning fold here, arrows with words beside them, and a whole legend to decipher on the instruction sheet. The grain was the first great secret and the most important. Every piece of fabric had a grain, a direction to its weave, running the length of it parallel to the finished edge that your teacher called the selvage, and every pattern piece carried an arrow that had to line up with that grain exactly, or the finished garment would hang wrong, twist on the body, sag and pull in ways you could not fix later. You learned to measure carefully from the arrow to the selvage at both ends, adjusting the tissue until it sat perfectly straight along the weave, and only then did you pin. The pinning itself was a patient art. You smoothed the fabric flat on the wide table, folded as the layout diagram instructed, and set each tissue piece in its place like a piece in a puzzle, fitting them together to waste as little cloth as possible, because cloth cost money and a thrifty cutter was a valued one. Then you pinned all around the edges, close enough to hold the flimsy tissue steady but not so close that the fabric bunched, and the little pins bristled up from the table like a field of silver grass. Then came the marking, the chalk on cloth. You traced the cutting lines and marked the notches that would later tell you which edge met which, and pressed little marks through the tissue to show where a dart began or a pocket sat. The tailor's chalk left a fine pale line, brushable away later, and there was something deeply satisfying in seeing the shape of a sleeve or a bodice appear on the flat cloth, a promise of the three-dimensional thing to come, and then the cutting and the courage it took. The scissors were long and heavy and sharp, and once they closed on the good fabric there was no undoing it. A wrong cut could ruin a length of cloth your mother had saved for, and so you cut slowly, following the chalk, keeping the fabric flat, holding your breath a little at the corners. The first cut into good material was a small rite of passage, a moment of committing yourself, and when it was done and the pieces lay separated on the table, you felt you had crossed some line into real seamstressing. The wonder of it was how the flat became round. Those strange two-dimensional shapes, so puzzling on the table, would fold and dart and seam together into something that fit the curves of a living body, a dress with a waist and a bust and a set of the shoulders, coaxed into being from flat cloth by nothing but careful cutting and clever sewing. The first time you understood that, truly understood how the pieces would come together, it felt like being let in on a magic trick, one that women had been performing quietly for generations at kitchen tables and cutting boards across the country. We rarely make our own clothes now, and the tissue patterns have grown scarce, and the skill of reading them has thinned out of the world. There is a small loss in that, the loss of a certain independence, the quiet power of being able to make a thing to fit yourself exactly rather than take what the store had hung on its racks. But you had it once, or a beginning of it. You had bent over the wide table and read the map of tissue and chalk and solved the puzzle piece by piece and understood at last that a dress was not a mystery, but a thing that careful hands could make. And that understanding, once gained, never entirely left you. It is a slower afternoon now, the kind meant for small, patient work. Your mothers and grandmothers had lived through years when nothing was thrown away, and that thrift lived on in this lesson. You learned to darn a sock by weaving new thread across the worn place until the hole simply disappeared. You learned to turn a frayed collar, to patch an elbow so neatly the patch became part of the shirt, to sew a button so it would never again come loose at the worst possible moment. It is a kind of knowledge we have mostly let slip away. But there was a deep, unhurried satisfaction in mending, in the belief that most things were worth saving. The darning came first, and it was a small marvel of patience. You slipped a wooden egg or a smooth burned-out light bulb inside the sock to stretch the worn place taut, and then, with needle and thread, you built a whole tiny fabric across the hole. First the long threads laid down one way, close and even, bridging the gap. Then the crossways threads woven over and under, patiently, until the two directions locked together into a neat new patch where the hole had been. Done well, you could scarcely find the mend at all, and there was a quiet pride in that, in making the damage vanish. Turning a collar was cleverer still, a small piece of household ingenuity. When a man's shirt collar frayed along its folded edge, as it always did first, you did not throw the shirt away. You carefully unpicked the collar, turned it over so the worn edge tucked inside and the good underside faced out, and sewed it back down, and the shirt lived on for another year or two looking nearly new. It was the kind of trick passed woman to woman, a small triumph of thrift over waste, and learning it made you feel let in on the practical wisdom of the generations before you. Patching had its own careful rules. A worn elbow, a torn knee, a thin spot in a work shirt, all could be saved with a patch cut from matching cloth, its edges turned under, set in place with stitches so small, and even they nearly disappeared into the weave. The art was in making the patch belong, in matching the grain and the colour, in stitching it down so neatly that it became part of the garment rather than an apology stuck on top. A clumsy patch announced itself. A skilled one kept its secret, and only the woman who sewed it knew it was there, and the buttons. Everyone thought they knew how to sew on a button, and almost no one did it right. You learned to set it firmly but not too tight, to build a little shank of thread beneath it so the button had room to sit over the buttonhole without straining, to finish it off so it would hold through washing and wearing, and the rough impatience of the person who wore it. A button sewn well stayed put for years. A button sewn carelessly popped off at the worst moment, in the cold, on the way out the door, and you learned to spare the people you loved that small daily aggravation. There was a whole philosophy folded into these humble lessons, and your teacher, who had lived through the lean years, believed in it wholly. Nothing worth keeping was thrown away for a small failing. A hole was not the end of a sock, nor a frayed edge the end of a shirt. Things were mended, turned, patched, and pressed back into service, and a household that knew how to do this was a household that stretched its money and honoured its possessions, and wasted nothing it did not have to. In hands like these, a modest income went a long, dignified way. We live differently now, and it is worth saying so plainly. A sock with a hole in it goes in the trash without a second thought. A shirt with a frayed collar is given away or thrown out. We have grown rich enough and busy enough to let the small art of mending fall out of our hands entirely, and mostly we do not even notice it is gone. There is comfort in that ease, but there is also something lost, some connection to our things, some quiet respect for the work and material that went into them. But on that slow afternoon, in the warm pastel room, you learned to save what could be saved. You wove the darn and turned the collar and set the button so it would hold, and in doing so, you learned something gentle and old and true, that most things given a little patience and a little care were worth mending rather than discarding. It was a lesson about cloth, but it was also, quietly, about a great deal more than cloth, and some of you would carry it your whole lives. Let's turn to a chore that filled an entire day in most homes, and so filled its share of lessons here too. You learned that laundry was not one task but many, each with its own rules. Whites and colours kept apart, delicates handled like something breakable. You learned which stains yielded to soaking and which needed a firmer hand. Learned the smell of bluing and bar soap and hot water. Learn to check a label and read a fabric the way you might read the weather. It sounds heavy now, in an age of one button and a hum. But there was a rhythm to it, and a pride in a line of clean, bright wash lifting in the wind. It began with the sorting, and the sorting was serious business. Whites in one pile to be washed hottest and hardest, for a white shirt or sheet had to come out truly white, or the whole wash was judged a failure. Colours in another, washed cooler and gentler so the dyes did not bleed and run, and turn a whole load a muddy, mournful shade. The delicate things, apart from both, the stockings and the fine blouses and the things that could not bear rough handling. You learned to sort by fabric and colour and how dirty a thing was, and to never, ever let a red sock find its way in with the sheets. Then the stains, each with its own remedy, a whole practical chemistry you committed to memory. Grease needed one treatment, blood another, and heaven help you if you used hot water on blood, for the heat would set it fast and forever. Grass, ink, fruit, coffee, each had its trick, its soak, or its scrub, or its dab of some particular thing. You learned to attack a stain before it settled in, to treat it while it was fresh, because a stain given time to dry and set became a far harder enemy. It was patient, knowledgeable work, the work of a woman who understood her materials. The washing itself was labour, real labour, even with the machines that were beginning to make their way into more homes. There was the sorting and the soaking and the scrubbing of the stubborn spots by hand on a washboard. There was the bluing, that little touch of blue added to the rinse to make the whites look whiter, a small trick of the eye that generations of women swore by. There was the wringing and the carrying of the heavy wet baskets, and the whole warm, damp, soap-smelling atmosphere of a kitchen or a back porch, given over entirely to the getting of things clean, and then the hanging out, which was its own small art. You learned to pin the wash to the line the right way, the sheets folded over and pinned along the top, the shirts hung by their tails so the shoulders kept their shape, everything spaced so the air could move between. There was even an order to it, a sense of pride in a well-hung line, the whites bright against the sky, everything lifting and snapping in the wind. A neighbour could read your housekeeping in your laundry line, and a line of clean, orderly, sweet-smelling wash was a quiet announcement that a capable woman lived here. The reward was in the smell and the feel of it after. Wash dried outdoors in the sun, and wind came back with a freshness no bottle has ever quite captured. The smell of air and light woven right into the cloth. Sheets dried this way felt crisp and cool against the skin at night. It was hard to explain to anyone who had not known it, that particular clean smell of sun-dried linens, but a woman who had known it never forgot it, and would go looking for it in vain among the boxes and bottles of later years. We have made all of this easy now, almost to the point of vanishing, and it is right to be grateful for that. A button, a hum, a warm tumble, and the wash is done, and no one aches from the wringing or the carrying, and no whole day is swallowed by the getting of things clean. That is a real mercy, and no one who ever did it the old way would wish the labour back. But something small has gone quiet with the ease, the rhythm of it, the pride of it, the sweet smell of a line drying in the wind. But you learned it that year, the whole patient science of it, the sorting and the soaking, the stains and their remedies, the bluing and the hanging and the reading of a fabric like the weather, and whether or not you would ever haul a heavy basket to a line yourself, you understood the care that went into so ordinary a thing as clean clothes, the knowledge and the effort a household ran on, mostly unseen. It was humble work, but it was real, and it mattered, and there was a quiet dignity in doing it well. Now the room grows warm and close, the way it did on ironing days. There's a smell you would know anywhere: hot cotton, faint scorch, the sweetish cloud of spray starch. You learn to test the iron with a quick, careful touch, to work a shirt in the proper order so you never wrinkled what you'd already smoothed, to press a collar crisp and a sleeve flat and a pleat sharp enough to stand on its own. It was hot, exacting work. But there was something almost meditative in it, in watching a rumpled thing become smooth and dignified under your hand, one long stroke at a time. The iron itself had a heft to it, a solid, business-like weight that surprised you the first time you lifted it. You learned to judge its heat, to hold your hand a cautious inch above the plate and feel the warmth radiating off it, or to touch a dampened fingertip to the metal and listen for the quick hiss that told you it was ready. Too cool, and it merely pushed the wrinkles around. Too hot, and it left a shameful yellow scorch. Or worse, a shining mark seared right into the cloth that no washing would ever lift out. The judging of that heat was a skill in itself, learned by feel and by the occasional small disaster. Order was everything, and this was the first real lesson. You did not simply attack a shirt at random. You started with the collar, then the cuffs, then the yoke across the shoulders, then the sleeves, then the body last of all, working always from the small detailed parts toward the large, so that you never crushed a finished section by reaching over it. A girl who ironed in the wrong order found herself pressing new wrinkles into a part she had already smoothed, chasing her own tail around the board, and your teacher drilled the sequence into you until it became a kind of choreography your hands could follow half asleep. The starch was its own particular magic. A collar limp and lifeless went into the starch and came out, after pressing, standing crisp and proud, holding its shape, catching the light. You learned to spray it just so, to let it sink in for a moment, to press until the steam rose in a sweet hot cloud and the fabric went smooth and firm beneath the plate. There was a satisfaction in it that bordered on the theatrical, watching a wilted thing transform into something sharp and dignified, ready to be worn by a man walking into an office or a church with his head held high. The pleats and the creases demanded the most patience of all. A sharp crease down a trouser leg, a knife-edge pleat in a skirt. These were the marks of a truly skilled hand, and they did not come easily. You learned to line the fabric up exactly, to press slowly and firmly, to use a damp pressing cloth between the iron and the good fabric so the finish would not shine. A crease set right stood sharp all day. A crease set carelessly wandered and softened and gave the whole garment a rumpled, unloved look, and you learned to tell the difference and to take the trouble. It was hot work, honest work, and it filled the room with a particular closeness. The steam rose, the smell of hot cotton and starch hung in the air. Your face grew warm above the board, and time seemed to slow to the rhythm of the strokes. There was a hush to it, a concentration, and yet there was something almost restful in that concentration too, a settling of the mind into a single simple task, the long smooth passes of the iron, the wrinkle giving way, the cloth going flat and clean and dignified under your hand. Some women came to love ironing for exactly this, for the quiet order it made of an anxious hour, and underneath the practical skill lay the same idea that ran through all these lessons like a warm thread. A pressed shirt said something. It said that the man who wore it was cared for, that someone had risen and taken the trouble, that this household did not send its people into the world rumpled and careless. A crisp collar was a small daily kindness, an invisible act of love folded right into the cloth. In an age that read a great deal into appearances, a well-pressed family was a family that had someone tending it with pride, and you were learning to be that someone. We press very little now, and think nothing of it. The clothes come from the dryer soft and passable, and we shrug at a wrinkle and go on, and the iron sits cold in the closet for months at a stretch. There is ease in that, and time saved, and no burned fingers or scorched collars to show for it. But something has quietly gone out of our clothes, and out of our mornings, some small pride and ceremony, some sense that how we present ourselves to the world is worth a little trouble. But you learned it, in that warm and steamy room, the whole patient art of it, the testing of the heat, the order of the strokes, the crisp miracle of the starch, the knife edge of a well-set crease. And whether or not you would ever stand for hours at a board yourself, you understood what went into a smooth collar and a sharp sleeve, the care and the heat and the quiet love of it. It was humble work and hot and easily taken for granted. But there was dignity in it, one long, smooth stroke at a time. Let's stand for a moment in front of the poster that hung in every home economics room in the country. It showed the food groups laid out in their tidy sections, a bright wheel telling you what a growing body needed each day. Milk here, meat and eggs there, the greens and the yellows, the breads and cereals, the fruits. You learnt that feeding a family was not just about filling plates, but about balancing them, that a good meal was a small act of nutrition and love at once. We take such things for granted now. But for many girls, this was the first time anyone had explained that food was something you could plan and get right. The chart itself was a cheerful thing, brightly coloured, its sections drawn like slices of a wheel or squares in a tidy grid, each one holding little pictures of the foods that belonged there. A frosty glass of milk and a wedge of cheese in one, a roast, an egg, a fish in another. Leafy greens and orange carrots gathered together, the fruits in their own bright corner, the breads and cereals filling out the rest. It hung where everyone could see it, and your teacher would tap it with a pointer as she spoke, and slowly its logic settled into you until you could see it with your eyes closed. The idea behind it was newer than you might think, and your teacher treated it with the seriousness of real knowledge. Because that is what it was. The notion that a body needed certain things each day, that health was built out of a balance of foods rather than simply a full stomach, was a genuine science, and it was being handed to you plainly and practically. You learned that a growing child needed milk for strong bones, that greens and fruits carried something invisible but vital, that a meal built only of one thing, however filling, left a body wanting. It was, in its way, a small revelation, and it was practical above all, meant to be used. Your teacher would set you the task of planning a day's meals, a breakfast and a dinner and a supper, and you would work to touch each part of the chart across the day, a little from every group balanced and complete. It was a puzzle with a right answer and a real purpose, and you bent over it seriously because you understood, even young, that this was knowledge you would truly use one day, standing at your own stove with your own family waiting to be fed. You came to see the meals of your own home differently once you knew the chart. You noticed what your mother served and understood, suddenly the wisdom in it. The glass of milk set by each plate, the vegetable that always appeared beside the meat, the fruit for dessert instead of something merely sweet. What had seemed like habit revealed itself as care, as knowledge quietly applied 3 times a day, and you saw your mother, perhaps for the first time, as someone practicing a real and demanding skill. There was love folded into all of it, and your teacher was careful to say so. To feed a family well was not merely to keep them from hunger, but to build them up, to give them the strength and the health to meet their days, to send them out into the world nourished in body and cared for in spirit. A balanced plate was an act of love as much as an act of nutrition, a daily unglamorous devotion that no one thanked you for and everyone depended on. You were learning to give that gift, plate by plate, meal by meal. We know a great deal more now, and the old chart has been redrawn many times over, its wheels and squares replaced by newer shapes and newer wisdom. Some of what it taught has held up and some has softened with the years. But the heart of it remains as true as ever, that food is something to be thought about and planned and balanced, that a family is fed best by someone who understands what a body needs and takes the trouble to provide it. But you had it explained to you, perhaps for the first time in your life, standing before that bright poster in the warm room, that feeding people was a skill, a knowledge, a thing you could learn and get right, that a meal was more than the filling of a plate, and whether you would go on to cook for a house full of children or simply for yourself, you carried out of that room the understanding that food was a form of care, planned and balanced and given with love, one thoughtful, nourishing meal at a time. It is the practical hour now, the one that would matter most in the years to come. Your teacher stood at the board and worked through a week of dinners the way another teacher might work through a proof, asking how you would feed a whole family well when the money was thin. You learned which cuts of meat cost less and rewarded patience. You learned to stretch a roast into a second meal and a third. You learned that leftovers were not failures but opportunities, that thrift was a kind of cleverness. And you began to see that running a household was, in its own quiet way, a genuine and demanding profession. The math of it was real and unforgiving, and your teacher did not pretend otherwise. A household ran on a certain sum each week and no more, and the woman who managed it had to make that sum stretch across every meal, every mouth, every hungry day until the next envelope came. She worked the numbers on the board plainly, the cost of this against the cost of that, showing you how a few careful choices could mean the difference between a family that ate well and a family that went thin by Thursday. It was arithmetic with real stakes, and you learned to respect it. The cuts of meat came first, and they held a whole education. You learned that the tender, expensive cuts were not always the wise ones, that a cheaper, tougher cut, a chuck or a shank or a piece full of bone and gristle, could be coaxed by long, slow cooking into something rich and tender and deeply satisfying. A pot roast simmered all afternoon, a stew built patiently from humble parts, a soup drawn from a bone that a richer, hastier cook would have thrown away. The cheap cuts rewarded time and knowledge, and a clever woman traded her patience for the money she did not have to spend. Then came the great art of stretching, of making one thing become many. A Sunday roast was not merely a Sunday roast, it was Sunday's dinner, and then Monday's cold slices, and then Tuesday's hash or Wednesday's soup drawn from the bones and the last shreds of meat. You learned to see a single purchase as a series of meals, to plan forward across the week so that nothing was wasted and every scrap earned its keep. It was a kind of strategy, a looking ahead, and there was a real cleverness in doing it well. Leftovers, in this way of thinking, were not the sad remainder of a meal, but the raw material of the next one, and your teacher taught you to see them so. The dab of vegetables became part of tomorrow's soup. The heel of bread became crumbs or pudding. The bones went into the stock pot. The fat was saved and used. The smallest things were kept and turned to purpose. A wasteful kitchen was a kitchen bleeding money, and a thrifty one was a small triumph of intelligence over scarcity. You learned to waste nothing, and to feel a quiet pride in the wasting of nothing. And through it all ran a truth that reshaped how you saw the women in your life. Running a household was not the simple, instinctive thing that people sometimes carelessly called it. It was a profession, demanding and skilled, requiring foresight and arithmetic and knowledge and no small amount of cleverness. The woman who fed a family well on a thin budget was solving a hard problem every single week, quietly, without applause, and doing it over and over for years on end. You began to understand that the work you were learning was real work and worthy of respect. We have grown richer since, most of us, and think less about these things, and let a good deal go to waste without a second thought. The tough cuts sit unbought while the tender ones fill our carts, and the leftovers slide forgotten to the back of the refrigerator, and we do not plan a week so much as decide each night on a whim. There is comfort in that plenty, and no one who ever went thin by Thursday would begrudge it. But something shrewd and capable has quietly gone slack in us, some hard-won knowledge of how to make a little go a long and dignified way. But you learned it in that practical hour, the whole clever science of it, the humble cuts and their patient rewards, the stretching of one meal into 3, the leftovers turned to opportunity, the week planned forward with care, and whether the years ahead would bring you ease or want, you carried out of that room a real and useful wisdom, and a new respect for the women who practiced it. Running a home, you understood now, was a genuine profession, and you were learning, dollar by careful dollar, to do it well. Let's sit with the little household ledger for a while. You were handed a narrow account book and a sharp pencil, and taught to write down every penny, the milk and the bread, the thread and the shoe repair, the small unexpected things that always came. At the bottom of the column, the numbers had to meet. It felt grown up in a way that thrilled and frightened you a little, because tucked inside those neat rows was a truth nobody softened, that someday a home's steadiness might rest in your hands, and that keeping it afloat would be part arithmetic, part discipline, and part quiet faith. The ledger itself was a plain and serious thing, its pages ruled into narrow columns, its cover stiff and unadorned, and there was something about being handed one that made you sit up a little straighter. This was not a schoolbook full of made-up problems. This was the very tool a grown woman used to keep her household from foundering, and to hold it in your hands was to be trusted for a moment with the machinery of a real adult life. You sharpened your pencil to a fine point and bent over the first empty page with a seriousness the exercise fully deserved. You learned to record everything, and the everything was the point. Not just the large expenses, but the small ones, the ones that slipped by unnoticed and yet, gathered up across a month, made all the difference. The bottle of milk, the loaf of bread, the spool of thread, the bar of soap, the nickel for the streetcar, the shoes taken to be resoled. A penny here and a penny there seemed like nothing on its own, but your teacher showed you how they added up, how a household could bleed away its margin in small forgotten sums if no one wrote them down and watched. The discipline of it was a lesson in itself. It was easy to spend and forget, to let the small purchases slide out of memory, and it took a real and steady discipline to record each one faithfully, day after day, whether you felt like it or not. But only the woman who wrote it all down truly knew where her money went, and only she could find the leak when the column would not balance. You learned that keeping accounts was not merely arithmetic, but a habit of honesty, a willingness to look plainly at the truth of what came in and what went out. And then the balancing, the meeting of the numbers at the bottom of the page, the money coming in on one side, the money going out on the other, and the two had to be reconciled, had to be made to agree, or something was wrong, and had to be found. There was a satisfaction when the columns met cleanly, a small triumph of order, and an uneasy feeling when they did not, a sense that a household out of balance on paper was a household headed for trouble in life. You learned to want that balance, to work for it, to feel its importance in your bones. It thrilled you and it frightened you, both at once, and your teacher did not shield you from the weight of it. Because the exercise was not really an exercise. It was a rehearsal for a responsibility that many of you would carry for real, and soon, the keeping of a home solvent through good times and lean ones, the stretching of a husband's wages across a family's needs, the quiet daily stewardship that no one saw and everyone depended on. To be handed the ledger was to glimpse that future and to feel, for a moment, how much it would ask of you. We keep our accounts differently now, if we keep them at all, in glowing screens that tally the sums for us and spare us the pencil and the patient columns. There is ease in that, and no arithmetic to trip over, and perhaps a little less discipline required of us for it. But something has grown fainter too, some intimate daily knowledge of exactly where our money goes, some hard, clear-eyed honesty about the true shape of what we spend. The ledger made you look. The screen too often lets us look away. But you learned it once, bent over that narrow book with your sharpened pencil, the whole grown-up discipline of it, the recording of every penny, the honesty it demanded, the balancing of the columns until the numbers met. And whether the years ahead would find you keeping a house of your own, or a life of some other shape entirely, you carried out of that room a real and sober understanding. That steadiness was something you built, sum by careful sum, that a home stayed afloat on arithmetic and discipline and quiet faith, and that someday the pencil might be yours. Now imagine the week itself, laid out like a song with a chore for every day. You learned the old homemaker's rhythm, the one your mother lived by without ever writing it down. A day for washing, a day for ironing, a day for the heavy cleaning, a day for baking, and Sunday kept apart for rest. You learned to dust in the right order, to sweep toward the door, to keep a home not in one exhausting rush but in small steady tendings. It is a different pace than the one we know. But there was a comfort in that rhythm, a sense that a life could be kept gently in order if you simply tended it each day. The old schedule was almost a song, and every woman of a certain generation knew its tune by heart. Monday for the wash, that great steaming labour to start the week. Tuesday for the ironing of all that Monday had cleaned. Wednesday and Thursday for the mending and the marketing and the heavier cleaning of the house. Friday for the floors and the polishing and the setting to rights. Saturday for the baking, so the house filled with the smell of bread and pie against the coming Sunday. And Sunday kept apart for church and rest and family, the one day the wheel of work paused and let a woman breathe. The wisdom of it lay in the spreading out, and you came to see it. A house was not kept by one great heroic burst of effort that left a woman flattened, but by the patient dividing of the labour across the days, a little here and a little there, each task in its appointed time. No single day was crushing, because no single day tried to do everything. The genius of the rhythm was that it made an impossible amount of work merely steady, turning a mountain into a manageable path walked one sure step at a time. Even the smallest chores had their proper method, and your teacher taught them with care. You dusted from the top down, so that what you brushed off the high shelves fell onto surfaces you had not yet cleaned, rather than settling back onto ones you had. You swept toward the door, gathering the dirt ahead of you and out, never chasing it back into the room. You aired the beds before you made them, opened the windows to let the staleness out and the morning in. There was reason behind every motion, an accumulated wisdom about how to do a thing efficiently and well, and you learned it as a craft. And there was a comfort in the very regularity of it, a comfort we have half forgotten. When you knew that Monday was for washing and Tuesday for ironing, you did not lie awake wondering what must be done or drowning in the shapeless whole of it. The rhythm carried you. Each day had its known task, and you met it and finished it and set it down, and there was a satisfaction in that completion, a sense of a life kept gently and reliably in order. The very predictability that might sound dull to us now was, to a woman running a household, a kind of peace. The house itself answered to that steady tending. Kept a little each day, in its proper turn, it never fell into the kind of disorder that takes a whole exhausting weekend to undo. It stayed, quietly, in a state of readiness and calm, so that a neighbour could drop by unannounced and find nothing to be ashamed of, so that a family came home each evening to a place that was clean and ordered and at rest. That steady, unspectacular upkeep was one of the great invisible achievements of the homemaker's art, noticed by no one precisely because it was done so well. We live by no such rhythm now, most of us, and our homes and our nerves sometimes show it. We clean in frantic bursts when company is coming, and let things slide between, and feel the shapeless weight of 100 undone tasks pressing all at once, because we have given none of them their own appointed day. There is freedom in our looseness and no rigid schedule ruling our week, but there is also a certain low, humming disorder that the old rhythm knew how to prevent, a piece we have traded away without quite noticing the cost. But you learned it once, the whole gentle order of it, the week laid out like a song with a task for every day, the washing and the ironing, the cleaning and the baking, and the Sunday set apart for rest. And whether you would ever keep a house by that old schedule or by some newer shape of your own, you carried out of that room a quiet truth worth keeping. That a life, like a home, is best tended not all at once but a little each day, and that in such steady, patient tending there is a real and lasting peace. Let's set a prettier table now, because this lesson was about welcome. You learned how to make a guest feel cared for, how to plan a meal you could serve without vanishing into the kitchen all evening, how to arrange a few flowers in a jar and fold a napkin into something lovely. You practiced pouring and passing, and the small graces that made a visitor feel like the most important person in the room. In a decade when the front door was always half open to neighbours, this was no small thing. It was the art of turning a house into a place where people were glad to sit and stay a while. The heart of it, your teacher explained, was that a guest should never feel like trouble. The whole art of hospitality lay in making the effort invisible, so that a visitor felt welcomed and easy rather than fussed over or in the way. A flustered hostess, forever leaping up and disappearing into the kitchen, made her guests uneasy, made them feel they had caused a commotion. The gracious one had thought it all through beforehand, so that when the company arrived she could simply be with them, calm and warm and present, as though feeding them well were the easiest thing in the world. And so much of it came down to planning ahead, to the quiet work done before anyone knocked. You learned to choose dishes that could be made in advance, or that would hold, or that did not demand your constant anxious attention at the stove. You learned to set the table early, to have the coffee ready, to arrange things so that the evening flowed without you forever ducking out to tend some crisis. The secret to seeming effortless, you discovered, was a great deal of unseen effort, all of it spent so that the guest would never guess how much there had been. The small touches were where the warmth showed, and you practiced them with care. A few flowers gathered from the yard and set in a jar on the table, costing nothing but transforming the whole feeling of a room. A napkin folded into something a little pretty, a small flourish that said this evening was special. The good dishes brought out, the ones saved for company, because a guest was worth the good dishes. None of it required money. All of it required attention and thoughtfulness, and the wish to make someone feel that their coming had been an occasion worth preparing for. Then there were the graces of the table itself, the pouring and the passing and the gentle management of a meal shared. You learn to serve from the proper side, to pass to the right, to keep an eye on your guests' plates and glasses so that no one had to ask for more, to fill a lull in the talk and draw the quiet ones in. These were small skills, but they added up to something real, a smoothness, an ease, a sense that the whole evening was being quietly and lovingly steered so that everyone at the table felt held and comfortable and glad to be there. It mattered more then than it might sound to us now, because hospitality was woven right through the life of the neighbourhood. The front door stood half open to the world. Neighbours dropped by. Friends stopped in. The visiting minister was fed. The relatives came for Sunday dinner. The woman down the street sat at your kitchen table over coffee while the children played. A home was a social place, a place of welcome, and the woman who kept it was the keeper of that welcome, the one who turned four walls into a place where people wanted to gather and linger. We entertain less now, and more anxiously when we do, and something warm has cooled in the change. We meet in restaurants, or not at all, and the dropped-in visit has grown rare, almost an intrusion, something we half dread. The open door has mostly closed. There is a privacy in that, and a kind of ease, but there is a loneliness in it too, a loss of the easy, generous, everyday hospitality that once made a neighbourhood feel like a single large and welcoming home. But you learned the art of it once, the whole warm craft of welcome, the planning that made effort invisible, the small touches that cost nothing and meant everything, the graces that made a guest feel cherished. And whether you would go on to keep an open door of your own, or simply carry the spirit of it quietly through your life, you understood something worth understanding. That to welcome someone well is a gift, and a skill, and a kindness, and that a home, at its warmest, is not a place you keep to yourself, but a place you gladly open so that others may sit down and stay a while. Now we come to the manners, the ones you were meant to carry out of that room and into the rest of your life. You learned when to unfold your napkin and where to rest your hands. You learned to wait until everyone was served, to pass to the right, to ask rather than reach. You learned the difference between eating and dining, and why the difference mattered to the people who loved you. Some of it may sound fussy to us now, but underneath every rule was the same gentle idea, that good manners were really just kindness, made into a habit small enough to practice every single day. The rules themselves were many, and you learned them one by one until they became second nature. The napkin unfolded in your lap once you were seated, not snapped open with a flourish. The hands resting quietly at the edge of the table, not planted upon it, not fidgeting, not disappearing into your lap. The waiting. Above all the waiting, until everyone had been served and the hostess had lifted her own fork, so that no one began alone, and no one was left watching others eat. Small things, each of them, but they added up to a way of being at a table that felt considered and calm. You learned the quiet choreography of the passing, to pass to the right, so that dishes travelled in one orderly direction round the table rather than colliding in the middle, to ask for the salt to be passed rather than reaching across your neighbour's plate, an outstretched arm being a small rudeness, an invasion of another's space, to offer a dish to the person beside you before serving yourself. It was a kind of dance, this passing and offering and asking, and its whole purpose was to keep the table flowing smoothly and to keep every person at it comfortable and included. The difference between eating and dining was the heart of the whole lesson, and your teacher lingered on it. Eating was merely the taking in of food, the animal necessity of it, done anywhere, anyhow, in a hurry. Dining was something else, something human, the gathering of people around a table to share not just a meal but a while of one another's company, with a little ceremony and a little grace to mark that the gathering mattered. To dine was to say that the people at the table and the time spent together were worth a measure of care. It lifted an ordinary need into a small daily civility, and beneath every particular rule, your teacher was always careful to reveal the same simple root. Manners were not empty forms, not fussy little laws made to trip people up or sort the high from the low. Manners were kindness, worn smooth by habit and made easy to practice. You waited so that no one ate alone. You asked rather than reached so that no one felt crowded. You chewed quietly and spoke gently so that the table stayed pleasant for all. Every rule, followed to its root, came back to the comfort and the dignity of the other people present. Good manners were simply consideration made into a habit. Because of that, the manners were a gift, both to those you sat with and to yourself. To the others, they gave ease, the quiet comfort of an evening where everyone knew what to do and no one felt awkward or overlooked. To yourself, they gave a certain freedom, the confidence of knowing how to carry yourself at any table, plain or grand, so that you never had to feel lost or out of place. A girl who knew her manners could sit down anywhere, among anyone, and be at ease, and put others at ease, and that was no small thing to carry into a life. We have loosened a great deal since, and some of that loosening is honest and good, a shedding of stiffness and empty show. We reach and we hurry and we eat before the screen, and much of the old ceremony has quietly fallen away. There is a naturalness in that, a lack of pretense, but something gentle has thinned along with the fuss, some habit of small daily consideration, some shared sense that the people we sit with are owed a little grace. The rules could grow rigid, yes, but at their heart they were only kindness, and kindness is never out of date. But you learned them once, the whole considerate code of it, in that warm and patient room. When to unfold the napkin, how to pass and ask and wait, the quiet difference between eating and dining, and whether you would carry every rule through your life, or let some of the fussier ones gently go, you kept the thing beneath them all, that manners, at their truest, are simply love made into a habit, that how we treat the people at our table is how we tell them, without a word, that they matter, and that this small daily kindness, practiced faithfully, is one of the gentlest gifts a person can give. Let's turn to the mirror for a moment. Home economics was not only about the home but about the young woman keeping it, and so there were lessons in what they called poise. You learned to stand tall with your shoulders back, to walk without hurrying, to shake a hand and meet an eye and speak clearly across a room. You learned about neatness and grooming, about a tidy collar and clean hands and a calm, pleasant way of carrying yourself through the day. We might smile at some of it now, but at its best it was teaching you that how you carried yourself was a quiet gift you could offer the people around you. It began with the body, with how you held yourself in a room. You learned to stand tall, shoulders back and down, chin level, spine long, none of the slouching and shrinking that a shy young girl fell into without thinking. You practiced walking too, moving smoothly and without haste, neither rushing nor dawdling, carrying yourself across a room as though you had every right to be in it. It felt strange and self-conscious at first, this deliberate attention to how you stood and moved, but slowly it settled into something like confidence, a way of inhabiting your own frame with ease. Then there was the meeting of other people, the small skills of greeting and being greeted, a handshake, firm but not crushing, offered with a level look. The meeting of an eye, that simple act of attention that so many young people found so hard. The willingness to look another person in the face rather than at your own shoes. A voice pitched to carry clearly across a room without shouting. Words spoken plainly and warmly rather than mumbled at the floor. These were the tools of moving among people with confidence, and you practiced them until the awkwardness wore away. Grooming and neatness came in for their share of attention too, and here the lesson was simple care, a tidy collar, clean, well-kept hands, hair neat, clothes pressed, everything about you speaking of a person who took a little trouble over herself. It was not about vanity or fashion or spending money you did not have. It was about presenting yourself to the world as someone who was cared for, if only by her own hand, someone put together and self-respecting, ready to meet the day with a little dignity. And underneath the standing tall and the firm handshake lay something deeper than mere appearance, something your teacher was careful to name. Poise, real poise, was not a performance put on to impress. It was a kind of composure, a steadiness, a quiet ease in yourself that let you meet whatever a day brought without flustering. The girl who had it could walk into an unfamiliar room, greet a stranger, weather an awkward moment, all without coming undone. It was confidence, yes, but a gentle confidence, rooted less in pride than in a settled sense of being at home in your own skin. And it was, in its truest form, a gift you gave to others as much as to yourself. A person who carried herself with calm and warmth, put the people around her at ease. Her steadiness was contagious, her composure soothing, her clear, friendly attention a small kindness to everyone she met. There was nothing selfish in learning to hold yourself well. It smoothed the way for those around you, made a room more comfortable, gave the shy and the uncertain someone poised to steady themselves against. Your ease became, quietly, everyone's ease. We might smile at some of it now, and not unfairly. The charm lessons could tip into something narrow, could carry a whiff of the notion that a young woman's chief task was to be pleasant and pretty and unobtrusive, and we're right to have loosened that. There is more room now for a girl to be loud, to be odd, to take up space, and that is a real gain. But something has been mislaid along with the fussier parts, some plain useful teaching about how to stand tall and meet an eye and carry yourself with a calm that steadies both you and the people near you. But you learned it once, before the mirror in that warm room, the whole quiet craft of it. To stand tall, to move with ease, to greet a stranger and meet an eye and speak clearly across a room. And whether you would take every lesson to heart or gently set the narrower ones aside, you kept the good of it. That how you carry yourself matters, not for vanity but for the ease it gives. That composure is a strength worth cultivating, and that a calm, warm, self-possessed way of moving through the world is, in the end, a small daily gift you offer to everyone you meet. It is a hushed lesson now, and a tender one. In an age when the doctor came to the house and much of the caring happened at home, you were taught the gentle skills of tending the sick. You learned to take a temperature and smooth a fever, to plump a pillow and turn a mattress, to make a light broth and a soft custard for someone who could not manage more. You learned that a cool cloth and a calm voice were medicine of their own. There was a solemn weight to this lesson that the others did not have, a sense that you were being trusted with something close to the centre of what it meant to keep a family. It was a different world of medicine then, and this lesson only made sense against that backdrop. The hospital was for the gravely ill, a place of last resort, not the first stop for every fever and flu. The doctor came to the house when he was needed, black bag in hand, but he could not stay, and between his visits the care fell to the woman of the home. A sick child, an ailing husband, an aged parent laid low, all were nursed in a bed down the hall, and the nursing of them was the mother's task, day and night, for as long as it took. This was not a small responsibility. It was sometimes a matter of life, and so you learned the practical skills of the sick room, plainly and seriously. To read a thermometer and know a fever for what it was. To bring a fever down with cool cloths laid on the brow. To keep a patient comfortable and calm. To plump and turn a pillow. To smooth a rumpled sheet, to turn a mattress and air a sick bed, for a body kept long abed grew sore and restless and needed tending, to keep a sick room quiet and clean and softly lit. These were the humble mechanics of care, and you learned them as things you might one day truly need to know. The feeding of the sick was its own gentle art, and you learned it with care. A body weakened by illness could not manage a heavy meal, and so you learned the light, kind foods of the sick room, a clear broth simmered and strained, a soft custard, a bit of toast, a cup of weak tea. You learned to tempt an appetite that had fled, to offer small amounts often, to nourish without overwhelming. There was love in this, in the making of a little something soothing for a person too ill to want it, in the coaxing of strength back into a weakened frame one small spoonful at a time. But the deepest part of the lesson was not in the thermometer or the broth. It was in the cool cloth and the calm voice, in the simple healing power of a steady, comforting presence. Your teacher taught you, without quite saying it, that half of nursing was the reassurance of it, the sense a sick person had that someone competent and loving was near, watching over them, unafraid. A panicked nurse frightened a patient, a calm one soothed. To sit quietly by a fevered child, to speak low and gentle, to be simply and reliably there, was itself a medicine, and one only love could give. There was a solemn weight to it all that set this lesson apart from the others, and you felt it in the room. Setting a table or pressing a collar was one thing, but this was the tending of a suffering body, the standing between someone you loved and the frightening dark of illness, and it carried a gravity the lighter lessons never had. You were being trusted, young as you were, with something close to the sacred heart of what a family was, the caring for one another in the hardest hours, the not being left alone when you were sick and afraid. It sobered you, and rightly. We have handed most of this over now, to hospitals and clinics and professionals, and in the main that is a mercy no one should wish undone. Real medicine is better and safer than a mother's cool cloth ever was, and lives are saved that once were lost. But something intimate has gone out of the caring, some closeness, some sense that to tend the sick with our own hands is part of what it means to love a person. We are relieved of the burden, and rightly grateful. But we have lost, a little, the tenderness that came bound up inside it. But you were taught it once in that hushed and tender hour, the gentle craft of caring for the ill, the thermometer and the cool cloth, the plumped pillow and the light broth, and above all the calm and loving presence that healed as surely as any medicine. And whether you would go on to nurse a houseful through every childhood fever, or rarely need the skill at all, you carried out of that room something grave and beautiful, an understanding that to care for the suffering is among the truest things a person does, and that a calm voice, a cool cloth, and a love that does not leave are a medicine all their own. Let's turn to the lesson that stayed with girls longest. Some schools kept a nursery corner with a bassinet and a bath and tiny folded clothes, and there you practiced the careful business of caring for an infant. More often it was a doll, weighted and lifelike, passed solemnly from hands to hands. But in a few programs there was, astonishingly, a real baby, borrowed for a season so the girls could learn in earnest. You practiced the cradle of your arm, the testing of the bath water, the folding of a diaper, the low hum of a lullaby. And whether the weight in your arms was cloth or truly warm, the lesson landed the same, soft and enormous. The nursery corner, where a school had one, was a place apart, hushed and careful and set up in earnest imitation of a real one. There was a bassinet with its small blankets, a little tub for bathing, a shelf of tiny folded clothes and diapers and pins, everything a baby might need arranged just so. To step into that corner was to step into a rehearsal for one of the largest things a life might hold, and even the most restless girl grew quiet there, sobered by the seriousness of what the corner stood for. The doll came first for most of you, and though it was only cloth and stuffing, it was treated with a gravity that shaped how you handled it. It was weighted to feel like a real infant, heavy and awkward in the arms of a girl who had never held one, and it was passed from hands to hands with a solemnity that no one had to be told to observe. You learned the cradle of the arm, the supporting of the head that could not yet hold itself, the careful, unhurried way a small, helpless thing had to be lifted and held and set down. In a few remarkable programs there was, astonishingly to us now, a real baby, an actual infant borrowed from an orphanage or a willing family for a term, living in the home management house so that the girls could learn on the genuine article. Imagine it, the weight and warmth and unpredictable reality of a true baby placed in your young arms, its cry that had to be answered, its needs that could not be set on a shelf when the bell rang. Whatever we might make of such an arrangement today, it lent the lesson a reality nothing else could, and the girls who lived through it never forgot the feel of that small true weight. And the skills you practiced were real, doll or baby alike. The folding and pinning of a diaper, done snugly but not too tight, the pin turned safely away from the skin. The testing of the bath water with your elbow or your wrist, never simply your hand, to be sure it was warm and never scalding for a skin so tender. The careful bathing itself, one hand always supporting, the slippery small body held secure, the dressing, the feeding, the low soft humming of a lullaby to soothe a fretful cry. Each was a genuine skill, taught in earnest, because for so many of you it would soon enough be genuinely needed. But beneath the diapers and the bath water lay the enormous thing the lesson was really about, and you felt its size even young. This was the care of a life utterly helpless and utterly dependent, a being that could do nothing for itself and relied wholly on the one who held it. To take that weight into your arms, even the weight of a weighted doll, was to feel the sheer magnitude of what it would mean to be a mother, the tenderness of it and the terror of it both, the vast, unhesitating responsibility of a life placed entirely in your hands. It was the lesson that stayed with girls longest, and it is not hard to see why. Many of you would go on, and soon, to hold your own real infants, and when you did, your arms would remember. The cradle and the support, the tested water, the folded diaper, the hummed lullaby, all of it would return not as something read in a book, but as something your very body had practiced in a bright schoolroom years before. There is no small number of women who first learn to hold a baby not from their own child, but from a weighted doll passed hand to hand in a home economics class, and who blessed that early practice when the true weight came. We prepare for parenthood differently now, or often hardly at all, and trust that instinct and hurried reading will see us through. Perhaps they do, but there was something in that early, solemn, hands-on practice, in the real weight taken up in young arms long before it was needed, that has quietly gone out of the world, and whether it was doll or true infant that they cradled, the girls who learned it carried out of that room the softest and most enormous lesson of all, that a life one day might be placed entirely in their keeping, and that to hold it well was among the most important things they would ever learn to do. Now the room fills with the smell of vinegar and fruit and bubbling sugar, because it is preserving season. You learn to fill the jars and seal them, to listen for the little pop of a lid pulling tight, to line the pantry with summer so it could be opened again in the cold. You learned the patience of it, the care that kept a family fed through winter and a household proud of what it had laid by. It is a skill that has mostly gone quiet in our time. But there was a deep ancestral satisfaction in a shelf of jars glowing like jewels, each one a small promise made to the months ahead. The whole room turned warm and fragrant when the canning began, the air thick with the sharp, bright tang of vinegar, the sweet, heavy cloud of fruit and sugar cooking down, the mineral steam of the great kettle at the boil. It was a smell that spoke of abundance, of a summer's worth of gardens and orchards being gathered up and saved, and it was a smell that a girl who learned it would recognize instantly for the rest of her life. A smell that meant work and plenty and the turning of the seasons all at once. You learned that it was serious work, and that the seriousness had a reason. This was not merely cooking, to be eaten and forgotten by evening. This was food meant to keep for months, to sit sealed on a shelf and stay good and safe through a long winter, and if it was done carelessly it could spoil, or worse, could sicken the family it was meant to feed. So you learned the rules with care, the scalding of the jars, the exact filling, the proper sealing, because here, more than almost anywhere, doing it right and doing it safely were one and the same. The jars themselves were part of the ritual, and you came to handle them with a kind of reverence. They had to be washed and scalded clean, hot when the hot food went in so they would not crack from the shock. You learned to pack them just so, the fruit or the beans or the pickles arranged snug but not crushed, the liquid poured to the right level, a careful space left at the top. You learned to wipe the rim clean before the lid went on, because a single seed or drop in the wrong place could spoil the seal and lose the jar. Then came the sealing, and the small suspense of it. The filled jars went down into the boiling water bath, or were processed by whatever method the recipe demanded, and then were lifted out steaming and set on a towel to cool. And then you waited, and listened, because as the jars cooled, the lids pulled down tight, and each one gave a small, clear, satisfying pop as it sealed, a little sound of success. You learned to love that sound, that tiny pop from across the room, each one meaning another jar safely closed, another small victory laid by against the cold. The reward was the pantry shelf, and oh, what a reward it was! Row upon row of jars glowing in the dim light like a treasury of jewels, the deep red of tomatoes and the golden amber of peaches, the green of beans, the ruby of jam, the pale crisp pickles. Each jar was a piece of summer caught and held, a bit of July's garden waiting patiently to be opened in the grey heart of January. To stand before a full and well-stocked pantry was to feel a satisfaction as old as agriculture itself, the deep animal contentment of a household provided for, of hard work made visible and safe and stored. And there was a real pride in it, a pride your teacher wanted you to feel. A woman who had put up her own harvest, had done something concrete and lasting, had taken the fleeting abundance of the growing season and made it keep. She had fed her family not just for a day but for months, had turned her labour and her care into rows of provision that would carry them through. It was thrift and skill and foresight all at once, the very heart of what it meant to keep a home well, and the full shelf was its proof, plain for anyone to see. We have mostly let this go quiet, and it is easy to see why. The grocery store holds summer's fruit in the depth of winter now, flown from across the world, and there is no need to labour over a steaming kettle in August to have peaches in the cold. That is a genuine ease, and few would trade the whole hot day of canning back for it. But something has slipped away with the need, some deep connection to the seasons and the harvest, some hard-won pride in having laid the winter by with your own two hands. But you learned it once, in that warm and fragrant room, the whole patient craft of it, the scalded jars and the careful packing, the boiling bath and the small triumphant pop of a lid pulling tight. And whether you would go on to fill a pantry every autumn, or rarely lift a canning kettle at all, you carried out of that room an old and rooted knowledge, that summer's plenty could be caught and kept, that a family could be fed through winter by the work of warmer months, and that a shelf of jars, glowing like jewels in the dim, was a promise made and kept, one careful jar at a time. Let's slow down for the prettiest lesson of all. Beyond the cooking and the cleaning, you were taught that a home could be made lovely with very little, that beauty was not the same as money. You learned about colour and light, about a fresh curtain and a well-placed lamp, about arranging what you already had so a room felt cared for and calm. You learned that a jar of wildflowers on the table changed the whole feeling of a meal. It was, in the end, a lesson about attention, about the idea that a home became a home not through grandeur, but through 1,000 small, loving choices made by hand. The first and gentlest truth of the lesson was that loveliness did not cost money. Your teacher was careful about this, because most of the girls before her came from homes where money was watched closely, and she did not want them to think that beauty belonged only to the rich. A room could be made warm and welcoming with almost nothing, she showed you, with care and thought and a good eye standing in for a full purse. The dollars mattered far less than the attention. A poor home tended lovingly could feel far richer than a grand one left cold. You learned the quiet power of small changes. A fresh curtain at the window, letting the light fall soft and clean into a room. A lamp placed just so, throwing a warm pool of glow into a corner that had been dim and unloved. A picture hung at the right height, a cloth laid over a worn table, a chair turned to face the window. None of it was expensive. All of it was a matter of seeing, of noticing what a room needed, and giving it that small thing. And slowly a plain space became a place that welcomed and soothed. The arranging of what you already had was an art in itself, and one you could practice with empty hands. You didn't need to buy new things to make a room feel cared for. You could move the furniture so the space flowed better, so a room felt open instead of cramped, so the eye rested easy. You could group your few nice things where they would be seen and enjoyed rather than scattering them unnoticed. You could clear away the clutter that made a room feel anxious and leave the calm of open surfaces. It was rearrangement, not purchase, and it cost only thought. The flowers were the lesson's small emblem, and you would remember them. A handful of wild flowers gathered free from a roadside or a field, set in a jar on the kitchen table, and suddenly the whole feeling of a meal was lifted. It said that someone had cared, had taken a moment to make the ordinary table a little beautiful, had thought the family and the day worth a small grace. That was the whole lesson in miniature, that beauty was a form of love, and that even the humblest table could hold a bit of it if someone troubled to gather the flowers. Because that, in the end, was what it was truly about, and your teacher wanted you to understand it. Making home lovely was not vanity or show, not keeping up with the neighbours or impressing a visitor. It was a form of care, a daily quiet love expressed not in words, but in the tending of a space so that the people who lived in it felt calmed and gladdened by it. A cared-for room told a family wordlessly that they were worth the trouble, that this was a place made warm on purpose for them. The loveliness was love, made visible. And it was attention, above all, that the lesson asked of you, the willingness to notice and to tend. A home did not become a home through one grand gesture, but through 1,000 small ones. A curtain here and a lamp there and a jar of flowers on the table. Choices made and remade day after day by someone who cared enough to see what a room needed. It was the accumulation of small, loving acts of attention that turned 4 walls into a place of warmth, and the homemaker's hand was the hand that made those 1,000 small choices quietly, all life long. We furnish differently now and faster, and often with more money and less thought, filling rooms with things bought quickly and loved little. There is comfort in the plenty, but something has thinned in the letting go of the old attention, some sense that a home is made by hand and by care rather than by purchase. some faith that beauty is a matter of seeing rather than of spending. We can buy a great deal now, but we have half forgotten how to make a room lovely with a jar of wildflowers and a well-placed lamp and a little love. But you learned it once in that gentlest of lessons, the whole quiet art of it. That beauty was not the same as money, that a curtain, a lamp, a handful of roadside flowers could change the whole feeling of a room, that a home became a home through 1,000 small choices made with care. And whether you would go on to keep a grand house or a humble one, you carried out of that room the loveliest understanding of all, that to make a place beautiful is to make it loving, and that the homemaker's tending hand, choosing and arranging and gathering the flowers, was itself a kind of quiet, daily, unspoken love. And so the light in the home economics room fades all the way down, and we come to the end of our long, quiet day. We spent it in a warm classroom with a row of little kitchens and a heavy dark sewing machine at every table, learning the ordinary arts of a life, the tying of an apron, the levelling of a cup of flour, the turning of a frayed collar so a shirt might live another year, the cradle of an arm around something small and precious. We watched a room full of girls bend seriously over their recipe cards, and we felt underneath all of it the same gentle idea returning again and again, that care is a kind of love, and that the ordinary work of a home is worth doing well. It is easy from here to romanticize them, and just as easy to pity them. But mostly they deserve to be simply honoured. The women who learned these things went out and lived them, quietly for decades, setting tables and stretching dollars and nursing fevers in the small hours, holding families together with hands that had first learned the work in a bright pastel room. They did not think of themselves as remarkable. They were just living and caring for their people in the plain and daily way that people always have. Maybe you carry one small thing forward from all of this. Not the whole vanished world, but a single thread of it, the willingness to slow down, to do one ordinary task with real attention, to make a table, a meal, a moment, a little lovelier than it needs to be, simply because someone you love will sit there. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the room goes soft around you, let that warmth settle over you like a folded quilt. You are cared for. You are here. And that has always, always been enough. Good night.